we will get to them. We will get to them eventually. Tom, thank you for coming. If you'd like to introduce yourself, everyone here, that would be brilliant.
Hi, my name's Tom. I am the candidate for the Liberal Democrats in Thursday's parliamentary by-election for Batley and Spen.
So, Tom, what's your sort of, I'll start off, what's your sort of general, just very general overview before we get into specifics on climate change and its effect on future generations?
So just a little bit about me. I went to uni, did an undergrad in biochemistry and a master's in public health. And one of the things that I sort of did as part of my master's in public health was looking at sort of impact on climate and how that might partly affect developing countries and health outcomes and resources there. There is no bigger issue for the entire planet than what we're facing right now in regards to the climate emergency. As well, when I was at university, just as I was finishing up my master's, I then was elected to Newcastle City Council for a year, where I was the opposition cabinet member for environment and climate, and then now as the group leader at Wakefield Council for Lib Dems, I'm sort of keen pushing on that. So I've had the joy and pleasure of actually at two different councils voting and speaking and pushing for declaring climate emergencies, which is, like I say, it's obviously top of the agenda, and really every election and every issue will be underpinned by climate and climate change.
So we'll start off with some of our questions. First one's around public transport. So affordable and accessible green public transport is essential, especially for young people travelling from work and school across large areas, especially when they're decentralised from major cities, like I know Batley and Spen is. So what is your opinion on making sure we can get more young people to actually use public transport?
So I think obviously public transport is really, really key to helping tackle the climate emergency. So in and around Batley and Spen, obviously there's bus service, which is not particularly great. There are a number of train stations. And obviously it's great that there are some public transport options, but it doesn't go further as far as it needs to go. Tickets can vary in price depending on which services you're using, and as well, where particularly for young people, it can be quite expensive even with any concessions. I mean, obviously Tracy Brabin, the former MP for Batley and Spen, which is why she's now West Yorkshire Mayor, and which is why we're having this by-election. One of the things that she's wanting to do as West Yorkshire Mayor is to bring back bus franchising and bring it back in-house and run it through the combined authority. And that's a good step in some respects, so that we have more local control over it, but it's not going to solve the issues of accessibility. It's one of the reasons that people often choose to jump in a car over public transport isn't just the availability, but it's also like the time and duration, and making sure that people can get between points A and B, and not always in a joint way is possible with public transport. One of the things that I know that we've seen other local authorities do, and another little bit of my background, I worked for an MEP for a short while as well, for when we had those. And one of the things that I was actually doing in that job was doing some research on green transport in European cities. So I was looking at European cities that had trialled free public transport to encourage people to sort of use mass transit networks in cities. So I mean, having an approach and looking at what we could do, not just in Batley and Spen, but across West Yorkshire as well, will be really, really key to that. One of the things that I'm quite key and passionate about is the fact that for a lot of people, you tend to find that public transport links go to the big cities, and that's the key problem. My hometown, also in West Yorkshire, is surrounded by North Yorkshire on three sides, and a great example there is that if you want to go cross-boundary anywhere out of West Yorkshire, it's just a bit of a nightmare. And obviously people who live in Batley and Spen don't just work and commute within West Yorkshire. There are people who do go further afield too. So when we're talking about public transport and investment in public transport, we do need to make sure that we have a sort of a wider thought about that as well, and look at weighing perhaps where people work and those employment corridors, rather than sort of previous sort of local authorities that have been drawn up a fair while ago now.
Yeah, so what I seem to be getting from you is like the from especially the local authority point is that they're a bit more arbitrary and people now travelling further afield in jobs. Absolutely. especially with London house prices getting more expensive, people are actually looking at commuting from Leeds and Sheffield and around the Batley and Spen area. So I do sort of hear your point. Speaking of sort of transport, even though it's a bit more international, the Leeds Bradford Airport expansion, what's your opinions on that?
Yeah, so obviously it's a key issue, not just for people in Leeds, but across Yorkshire as a whole, and including in Batley and Spen. The new terminal is obviously going to seek to expand what provision is already there, and we know that actually one of the best ways to sort of tackle climate is to stop sort of unnecessary flights. This is one of the sort of issues that surrounding that. To me, the airport in itself it's a little bit remote and redundant anyway. It's really inaccessible. The proposed facilities to it don't necessarily make sense either. So they're talking about having a rail link, but then you'll have to get a shuttle from the rail link to the airport, which doesn't really make sense. And the entire project from the get-go seems to be a bit higgledy-piggledy. And it seems more about building a nice new shiny building to cut open with a red tape rather than actually tackling the issues that people care about. This is one of the things that I often think is overlooked, and I might be remiss to say this, but obviously we do have another airport in Yorkshire. We've got Doncaster, Sheffield as well. So expanding one airport when we've already got another not too far away as it is, and Manchester, the other side of the Pennines, isn't exactly a million miles away either, which has already got a lot better transport links. Obviously, there are some instances where people need to take planes. As much as I'd love to be able to hop on a train and get to the continent, it's still broadly inaccessible to do that at the minute. So yeah, in terms of the airport expansion at Leeds Bradford, it's not the right priority and not the right time.
So at Teach the Future, we focus, one of our main acts is decarbonisation of school buildings. So what is, if elected as the MP for Batley and Spen, what action should you take if you support our ask to decarbonise school buildings?
So one of the big things that the Liberal Democrats have pushed on previously is about trying to introduce a green investment bank again. So in 2010, when we were in government, we did introduce a green investment bank, and we massively increased the uptake of renewable electricity. So we had, in government, Ed Davey, now leader of the Liberal Democrats at the time, the cabinet member for environment and climate change and biz and other things as well. He obviously almost quadrupled renewable energy. So that's key to make sure that these buildings are not only more efficient, but the source of the fuel is clean as well. We know that in terms of making sure that we were to roll out a green investment bank, which would enable people to not only create green jobs, but to fit buildings up to a higher standard of insulation so that they are sort of future-proofed and also made more eco-friendly. I sit on a board of governors for a primary school and a board of governors for my old FE college as well. And I know obviously there are certain things that certainly the board of governors that I'm on are already trying to do this in ways which we can, but the funding just isn't there from central government. And quite often with primary schools and with the education sector in general, like there isn't enough funding there for them to do all the things I'd love to do in regards to making sure that we have greener, cleaner schools.
So this very quick one, I think it's really a very couple of sentences really, just on the Leeds still plan to introduce a low emission zone, so similar to the ones used in London and Birmingham. Do you support these measures within Leeds?
So within Leeds, I think having low emission zones are a good step, but they're not going to be the solution. They're not going to be the solution to the problem. The problem is people jumping in cars and using cars as a primary mode of transport anyway. So it's a cultural thing that we need to get around. And what we tend to see with low emission zones is it actually just moves the problem rather than tackles it. So I think it's a good first step to try and encourage people. But actually, I think that we need to look at incentivizing people, so rolling out electric charging points. Again, electric vehicles aren't necessarily the answer either. We need to think about including active transport and encouraging cycle lanes, bus lanes, and all these other things too. Low emission zones on their own to deter motorists aren't going to be enough.
So we'll move on to some climate in education. So climate change is going to be a big part of our futures. So our education should prepare us for this. How will you and your party ensure that students are equipped with the skills and knowledge needed to tackle the climate change and enter the green job market?
So I think, first of all, one of the things that I think is quite key is really it's enabling that next generation. So I know the Liberal Democrats have called on the government to use profits from green infrastructure projects to create a new fund for climate action and green jobs. And I think really incentivising and instilling from when people start at school that sort of the vision for this country, the Liberal Democrat vision for this country is for a cleaner, greener, fairer, more caring society. And we have to have a green strand that runs through every single policy. We shouldn't be looking at issues. My frustration is that often we tend to just look at green issues in isolation, and every single thing that the government does should have that at the heart of it. So I think really making sure that people, students at school, are brought up in a way in which they're socially and environmentally conscious about the choices that they make is really key to making sure that the next generation is, well, we know already the next generation is more eco-friendly and a lot more environmentally conscious, but going further and making sure that's something that touches everyone.
Yeah, so I think you might agree with it. It's vital that students have an understanding of the climate crisis so that they can teachers have a vital understanding of the climate crisis so they can teach students about it. However, our organisation Teach the Future released research showing that 70% of teachers feel they do not have the adequate training to teach the climate crisis. How will you and your party ensure that teachers are able to incorporate the climate emergency and ecological crisis in their lessons across the curriculum?
So I think actually a great example of this is what's recently happened in Wales. We've had a new Welsh curriculum which was led and spearheaded by Welsh, at the time, Education Minister Kirsty Williams, and that had a big push on all sorts of things, including Welsh language teaching, and also the environment was in there too, and giving teachers more scope. But we do need to make sure that teachers have the ability to seek out training and resources to help them educate themselves on issues like this. The key point and the barrier, one of the barriers to that is, at the moment, we know teachers are very much overworked and don't have time as it is. So really investing in education in the broadest sense will also have benefits for teachers to then be able to go away and also pick things up like additional training. I know obviously when there are inset days, certainly within the Board of Governors, the school that I'm on the Board of Governors for, things like social issues do come up. And I think really making sure that the climate emergency is seen as one of those key issues that needs to be addressed in not just in classrooms, but also in the playground, and getting that message through the school into parents as well is also going to be key to this.
And the bill you're talking about in Wales, actually, our Welsh branch, Teach the Future, actually managed to submit some amendments to this, which sadly did fail through Plaid Cymru, which was a big help. And I think we need to look at it. I think we at Teach the Future will agree that it doesn't go far enough in Wales, but that's probably because we are climate change activists and we're in this world. So I think in Wales, it's a good first step. Yeah, but I think you may also agree that we need to go a bit further into making sure that
absolutely.
people.
I think, I mean, having something at least on par in England would be a great start, and really sort of pushing that forward. And I think fundamentally, I know as a party, we want to see substantial investment in the education system, which will then free teachers up to be able to actually have more conversations, more smaller class sizes, and be able to do more in the classroom, which will only benefit students in terms of being able to have conversations around issues like the climate emergency.
Yes, I think what we're looking at, it's what you're sort of talking about is that the education system doesn't just need to evolve on the front of climate, it needs to evolve the whole. You probably will agree that class size is now getting too big. So you're losing that connection between student and teacher, which will then of course mean that you can't get to students that need help, and you leave students behind. And when we've got climate, the climate crisis can also be incorporated after we start seeing the effects of education reform.
Yeah.
There you go. The pandemic has been such an impact on young people and their education. How will you and your party ensure that students are prioritised and supported as we recover from the COVID pandemic?
So this was one of the issues that came up fairly recently. We saw that the government had put together its sort of fund for students to catch up, and it comes nowhere near what other governments in other countries around the world are doing to sort of help play catch up as a result of missed learning from the pandemic. Other countries around the world, the US, with spending thousands of pounds per pupil to help people catch up. And in the UK, it's just not enough. It's literally, I think, worked out something like the equivalent of like £50 per head, which just when you see what that is in comparison to other countries, it just pales and it's quite galling. I think we have seen a massive sea change in the way in which learning's happened and learning's commenced, whether it be virtual or socially distanced. And obviously, there are some children that have been left behind a lot more than others. As a counsellor, some of the issues that I've been dealing with are, like, for instance, I've got a couple of parents who I've been helping try to get additional sort of additional teaching methods in place because their children can't use laptops or need, usually would have a TA, a teaching assistant in the classroom, but at home they obviously didn't have that provision. So one of the concerns was if we were to end up in a situation again where the schools are shut down because there's been a localised outbreak of COVID, that then we'd end up back in the same situation. And this is the real issue, actually, is that whilst now, broadly speaking, most children are back in the classroom, we're still seeing this sort of whack-a-mole where schools have been shut down or people's been sent home and isolating and bubbles been opened and closed. And that's really making some children across the UK be more disadvantaged than others. And really, that we need to sort of think about the best way to bring everyone in that cohort forward rather than just, you know, leaving a few behind, which is what's quite possibly going to happen at the rate we're going.
Yeah. Wait, yeah. Sorry, I completely lost my place. A recent survey by the environmental charity Global Action Plan revealed that 70% of students say that they're thinking about climate change. Thinking about climate change makes them anxious. How will you tackle this sort of issue within the younger generation about climate anxiety?
So I think that one of the things that's really key, in one of the things that the Liberal Democrats have always led really well on, is making sure that we have parity for mental health and physical health. And if people are feeling anxious about the climate emergency, that might be that they're feeling anxious in general, and it's not just specifically in relation to the climate. It might be that there are other issues that are related to that. I think what is key is actually one of the things that the government at the minute is doing, the Tory government is doing, is it's very much this gesture politics, where they're talking towards and creating targets that are arbitrary, meaningless, and don't actually tell people what progress has been made. And actually having some firmer, more green grasp on what we should be aiming for and where we're at would be the first step in that. Quite often people feel like that the climate emergency isn't been taken seriously and it's not been meaningfully tackled. So I think really sort of, you know, we've got task forces for all sorts of different things. We've seen a COVID task force. You know, one of the things that I was quite pleased is, as a local councillor in neighbouring Wakefield, at my very first council meeting, when we had on the agenda the climate emergency motion, what I said to the Labour administration there is actually, instead of creating a new portfolio for digital skills and technology, if there was another cabinet post that needed to be created, it would be a cabinet member for climate change. And later down the line, the Labour Council did introduce a cabinet member for climate change, and we should have a dedicated cabinet member for the climate emergency in Westminster too. DEFRA or just the environment isn't enough at this point. Like, we're going too slow. And, you know, fundamentally, it's going to be the next generation that has to deal with that and pay that price. And until we start taking it seriously and start listening as well, that's people are going to continue to feel anxious, and that's really quite horrendous to even think about that. I think certainly for me, when I knock on doors and speak to people, when people have concerns, quite often that's the first time they've been able to air and vocalize them. So actually listening is like the first step in this to people's concerns about climate. Is it a particular thing? Is it, you know, like, and tied with climate is air quality too. from public transport. Like, and that's something that's come up fairly frequently, actually, on the doorsteps when I've been speaking to people in Batley and Spen. So I think actually listening and having an open door for people to come to an MP and talk to them about those issues is the first sort of step in making sure that people feel they're being taken seriously, which should hopefully sort of allay some of those worries. On a national level, being a vocal champion on it is the best step to sort of make people feel a little bit like the corner's been fought for.
Yeah. This is now on green jobs, our next sort of topic, very much connected to the last one. Many parties have spoken about the recovery from the pandemic. We've just asked you a question about it. As an opportunity to build back in a more sustainable way. However, there has been little to no talk about this in affecting unemployment rates among young people. Still in education. What will your party do to ensure more eco-friendly jobs, especially for part-time ones, available for students and young people who are still in full-time education?
So I know one of the things that we're as a party pushing on is a massive £48 billion pledge for local councils. Over 3 years, we want to in total put forward a package of about £150 billion for a green COVID recovery plan. The 48 million of that for local councils, like I say, would be ring-fenced specifically to funding green infrastructure and investments to improve local communities and environments. So Liberal Democrats, we care about the environment because local people and communities care about the environment. One of the very few positives we've seen over the last, 16 months now, is that people have been able to spend time in their local area and actually really appreciate it. So I think making sure that we are still funding, financing and improving cycle paths and green spaces that people didn't realise they had before is key to that. In terms of a sort of part of the recovery plan, the Green Recovery Plan, is we want to make sure we have the £20 billion community clean air fund as well, which would basically, boast a treble dividend for local communities in terms of health, environment and economy. And having a thriving economy is what really will be making sure that there are jobs there for the next generation and younger people. We want to spearhead a local transport revolution as well, to improve people's transport choices. We want to target all transport emissions that affect people. So that does include like the active transport side of things, the walking and cycling routes, new light rail and tram projects too, giving more power to local authorities to build mass transit systems and more powers to borrow in able to be able to afford to build these themselves. We also want to see sort of Leeds is a great example of this, where the City of Leeds has considered a wide variety of transport options already previously, and there's been many plans before, but we've just not got there previously. So actually really pushing forward the fact that we need central government intervention and involvement to make sure that these do go ahead is really key. Like Leeds, literally down the road, is the largest or one of the largest cities in Europe without a mass transit system. Obviously, when we sort of build green jobs and we create new infrastructure, there'll be some short-term stuff like the actual sort of labouring behind getting the infrastructure in place, but obviously there'll be long-term jobs as well in terms of maintaining that infrastructure, managing it, and the whole different sides of things. And with that will come a whole host of different jobs. You mentioned part-time jobs. Specifically for young people. I think actually as a society we need to think about the way in which we work and how the COVID pandemic has impacted on that. I think people are now seeing or wanting more flexibility in the work patterns and also working arrangements, like the ability to work from home. And being able to work from home is one of the easiest ways to cut emissions if people aren't unnecessarily driving to an office 30-40 minutes away every day and sitting in traffic on the M62 or wherever it may be. So I think actually making sure that there are flexible arrangements for all workers is key, and that includes for young people and new jobs and people who might be students at the time too.
So swinging from young people entering the workforce, we're going to briefly touch on people leaving the workforce into retirement. What is your opinion on the West Yorkshire Pension Fund investing in fossil fuels? Do you support de-investment, sorry, from fossil fuels?
So it's funny you should ask this, actually. I have at Wakefield Council a number of times asked this very same question. I had, back when it was a different cabinet member for resources, I'd asked them at full council, specifically asking, it is completely incoherent for any local authority to say that the climate change is the most important thing, to declare a climate emergency, to declare a biodiversity emergency, and then still be profiting from fossil fuels. And that is something that I have asked, like I say, 3 times, no less than 3 times, to people in local government already. And that same question needs to be asked not just in Wakefield, but across West Yorkshire, across Yorkshire and across the country. And having an MP who would really lead and fight on that and say that obviously we want to have good pensions for people to retire on and be able to have security in their older age, but at the same time there are more ethical ways to do that.
Yeah. So talking back on still on jobs, how will you and your party work to build new green jobs in post-industrial areas like Batley and Spen? I come from a couple of constituencies across from Batley and Spen, so I'm from very much the Red Wall area, post-industrial towns. I understand burden. So will your plan also involve green vocational jobs, like an apprenticeship for young people who are choosing a different path out of the education system?
So one of the things that is, was really sort of nice to see, the Board of Governors that I sit on for the FE College, we've got a big push on vocational options for people post 16 and apprenticeships as well. And that college, I'm on the Board of Governors for, partnered with Drax. And whilst Drax has now moved away from the coal-fired power station, it is a wood pellet one, which is not great. Still, like, we obviously want it to be more green and we want it to be completely renewable rather than chopping down trees and ferrying them over from the US. It's not a solution. I don't think anyone pretends it is, but it's marginally better on balance than coal. Like, we've already got a partnership with there, so making sure that we connect these dots with the FE sector, with local businesses, with the energy sector, with the renewable sector in particular. One of the great things that happened when we were in government as well is, when we also were, I believe we were running Hull Council at the time, is we got investment from Siemens to build the wind turbine factories there as well, which was great. So we've seen this, like, Hull is a great example of a place that has suffered from deindustrialisation, and the Liberal Democrats have a track record of bringing green jobs there too. The same in the northeast of England as well. Up in Newcastle, we had a plant there, and we had some there's more also outside Newcastle as well in Durham. There's high-speed trains being built there as well for the continent. Like, the Liberal Democrats, certainly in government and in local authorities, have a record of doing that. And as a Lib Dem MP for Batley and Spen, I would certainly fight tooth and nail to make sure that we've got green jobs here, that not only just green jobs, but also good green jobs that pay a decent wage. The answer is not getting more minimum wage jobs. We need to have aspirational jobs so that people who live in the constituency don't have to move away to be in a well-paid job, because that's something that's all too common.
Yeah, you don't ever want especially brain draining constituencies, especially in the Red Wall more. Yeah. We've started to see that a lot more. How will you work with Tracy Barbin, the newly elected mayor for West Yorkshire, to implement climate policies around the area that have now been devolved to the West Yorkshire Combined Authority?
So first of all, I must, if I confess, I must have said I've had a few run-ins with Tracy, not personally, politically, of course. One of the things that is really taxing, and that's the pun unintended there, is the fact that the new mayor does have the ability to levy a mayoral precept. And one of the things that I've said locally and at Wakefield Council, the neighbouring local authority, is that at this point, due to the COVID pandemic, that I don't think residents, certainly in my neck of the woods and certainly in other places across West Yorkshire, can necessarily afford an additional mayoral tax. There are other ways in which the mayor can levy a budget and levy resource to invest. Obviously, Tracy had 10 pledges and was elected on that manifesto, but certainly pushing to make sure that the climate pledge is at the top of that pile, the top of that 10 is what I would do. By electing a Liberal Democrat MP in Batley and Spen, I think it would be a really clear message to hold Tracy's feet to the fire. This is obviously the seat that she's vacated. And someone there who will push her on green issues is absolutely the way to influence and work with Tracy on that. And as I mentioned before, obviously, I think one of the big issues is the bus franchising and also mass transit, and making sure that's done in a way that makes sense.
Because I know they're also doing it in Manchester as well, aren't they? Under Andy Burnham, they're bringing it into public ownership. So we're now going to open up open up for questions from. I know I've done a couple now. I'm not going to lie, but some more from while they connect to the options, some more from the audience who are watching. Let's see if my brilliant colleagues from Teach Future have sent me some. They have. Do you support the practice that currently exists within the education? Yes, it is. Education management of external. 1 minute. Let me redo this. Thanks, Ali. Do you support the practice that currently exists within education management of external inspections and school rankings? If not, what would you propose to an alternative regulation of education? So I assume this is sort of more talking about Ofsted with your connections as a governor in school, to schools.
So I think the way in which schools are assessed currently can actually be quite damaging. And I think that what we do see is we see teachers quite often preparing to be trained to jump through hoops rather than focusing on teaching and education all year round, and it can be quite stressful for staff. And certainly when you get inspections, it can be stressful for governors too. Like what we need a more cohesive approach to education, one that isn't centred around exams, and that goes not just for Ofsted but also for students too. Like we should have a cohesive, sort of well-rounded approach to learning, where people are taught and actually learn along the way rather than just memorising to pass a test, which is what often happens at both pupil level but also teacher level as well. I'm not sure what the exact alternative would be. I think that if you look at other Scandinavian countries, places that have a more a less classroom examination based systems, those seem to actually have better educational attainment and outcomes. And I think that certainly is something I'd like to learn from.
Yeah, and I guess we can't, with stuff like education, we've got different cultures around the world. So what will work for us in Britain will be definitely different, similar to Europe. But look, if you look at Asia, for example, we can have the same model in the UK. I don't think it wouldn't work. What are your opinions on the introduction of a Green New Deal bill within the UK, and would you support such legislation if elected to the House of Commons on Thursday?
So in terms of a Green New Deal, I absolutely think this is something that we should be doing now. I think it's got a number of different threads to it that would largely all be positive for not just for country pupils, but the planet, most importantly. So in terms of the fact that we know that at the minute, like interest rates are still relatively low, like they're really quite low. So to borrow now to build infrastructure is key. It's going to be in terms of the Green New Deal. I think what I would say is it's just been sort of it's very US centric, and I think whilst we might call it a Green New Deal, what we would do here would be largely different to what the US would do under Biden. I think obviously making sure that we don't end up sort of using it for frivolous purposes, and but it depends it's difficult, because if there was an introduction of a Green New Deal in Parliament tomorrow and it's by the Tory government, like in principle, yes, if it's doing the right things, it'd be about making sure that bill would include the things that we want to see in there and isn't just going to be paying sort of lip service to the idea of being a Green New Deal. So I think at the minute we've seen quite a lot of promises and a lot of things have been said about them. When you actually read into it, it doesn't really stack up. I mean, so for me, depending on what's in that Green New Deal, like I would say absolutely. If we'd have to amend it, if that was possible to make it sort of better, then obviously that needs to be done. But in principle, like, a Green New Deal is certainly something that is probably one of the best things to help the economy now as well, and also the planet.
Yes, yes, I can't agree more with you. What subjects do you think should be introduced in schools in order to spark discussion and development of sustainable skills to mitigate the climate emergency?
So one of the things that I always really enjoyed, even when I was at primary school, we always used to have school councils, and I can remember even then having arguments over whether we should have plastic water bottles. I think actually, like, even leaving things like that, which might sound trivial on the surface of it, actually do spark that debate and that conversation. I think also, like, lots of schools now certainly have iPads or laptops, and actually teaching people where those devices go when they're done. Like, we know batteries are really difficult to dispose of and are not particularly great for the environment. I think educating people on those issues, on the resources that they use on a daily basis in the classroom, is a really good way to sort of engage and sort of make people make pupils think about these things. Again, like I said earlier, like we often tie through issues through curriculum in order to make sure that there's like, sort of green issues should be sort of thread through the curriculum anyway. I think that really sort of asking children to come up with creative approaches, one of the best ways to engage with people is to get them to do something rather than just sort of sitting and talking. So thinking about the ways in which we teach with pupils on the climate emergency, like it doesn't need to be all boring, cut and dry, sort of lecturing effectively, because that's not going to inspire a new generation of people to go forward and be the sort of the environmental champions that we need them to be.
So just a couple more questions now. What would you want a progressive alliance in elections and I assume that means in local elections and within Westminster? And right, I'm going to redo that. I think I know what it means now. Would you like a progressive alliance in elections and also once elected to Westminster? And do you think this would assist in acting meaningful climate action? There we go, I got that.
It's fine. So I think one of the things that is quite clear is that obviously there are more parties on the centre and centre left of the political spectrum than there are on the centre right, or certainly serious parties with a credible chance of winning. I think it's difficult. Like if you look at, for instance, if we talk about progressive alliances, if you look, say you were to get Labour and the Greens and the Liberal Democrats all around the table to try and figure out what could work, like the vast majority of seats where the Greens are in places where they could win are in Labour areas. So it wouldn't necessarily benefit the Labour Party to sit down and have a conversation with the Greens. It would only, unless the Greens were to unilaterally stand down for Labour, then it wouldn't be of benefit to Labour. If you look at, the Liberal Democrats were now second in over 60 Tory-facing seats, but yet there will be people in the Labour Party who wouldn't want to stand down for us there. So it's really quite difficult to try and manage that in a way which would ever make sense. And I think the Liberal Democrats have the ability to take from parties like the Tories that other parties don't. Like we saw that in Cheshire and Amersham just a week ago, that we got a massive swing from the Tories that I just don't think would have happened in other places to the Labour Party. What I do think is important, I think obviously the electorate and voters are able to come to their own decision on who's best placed to oust the Tories if that's what they want to do. But I don't think it resonates well on the doorstep if there's the idea that there's been some sort of stitch up behind the scenes to try and jimmy the election result in advance of polling day. I think that can be quite damaging. I mean, in terms of, do I think it would assist in enacting meaningful climate action? I don't think it would, if I'm honest. I think we'd probably end up arguing over all sorts of other things, and the climate emergency, like weirdly enough, the climate emergency is one thing that I think most parties, certainly the Labour Party, the Greens and ourselves, are all in agreement that it is a big issue, needs to be dealt with. I don't think that would be as sad as it sounds if we were to talk about progressive alliances. I think the nature of talking about progressive alliances is one about elections and democracy and the way in which this country runs. And I think that we'd probably just end up going round in circles talking about how we have electoral reform before anything else. Whether or not electoral reform would be good for the climate emergency, I'm sure it probably would be. You'd probably see a heck of a lot more Liberal Democrats, a heck of a lot more Greens in Parliament, and that could only be good in itself. But how we get there, I don't think is simple, and I certainly don't have the answer to that. Do I say proportional representation? Absolutely. Like, it's one of the reasons electoral reform is one of the reasons that I joined the Liberal Democrats. Like, we've had a consistent commitment to trying to get proportional representation, and not only that in the House of Commons, but also reform in the House of Lords as well to make it elected.
Would you also devote hearing? This is one of my questions I was speaking on, sort of might be slightly off the climate topic, but I heard Andy Burnham on, I think it was Owen Jones's documentary about Batley and Spen, about talking about English devolution or more devolution to local mayors. Would you support that if you were elected to Parliament?
So one of the things that I really do not like, if I'm honest, is the elected mayoralties we've currently got. So for West Yorkshire, actually what they did was take powers away from local authorities. So Tracy Brabin can now effectively, she can zone land for mayoral development, and she can ram that through above local authorities, taking decisions away from local residents and local councils. And to me, devolution is about giving power to the lowest level, not giving it back up the food chain. So I think that the new layer of the mayoralty that we've got in West Yorkshire isn't something that should automatically be assumed as devolution, or even if it is to some degree, not a good example of it. What I would like to see is to see devolution spread out to local authorities where it's appropriate. Obviously, for some things we can't have, for me, transport, it would make more sense for transport to be devolved to Yorkshire as a whole and have transport for Yorkshire. That seems like something that would be on par with transport to London, same with the Greater Manchester arrangements, and having something that's integrated across Yorkshire makes more sense. I think in terms of the other sort of powers the mayors have got is like they're not all necessarily, like all these mayors we've got aren't equal. So at the minute it's quite a hodgepodge of different things. Like obviously Tracy's got the police and crime commissioner responsibilities rolled into her post. If you look up to the northeast where you've got Jamie Driscoll for the north of Tyne, he doesn't, and there's still a police and crime commissioner. So I think at the minute, like having some sort of like actual common denominator of what devolution means across English regions would be beneficial. I don't think the answer is an English parliament. I think, again, that would probably just have too much power in one place. I think probably the best example, and this is me, like as a party of Liberal Democrats, we passed a motion at conference talking about having a federal United Kingdom and a federal approach to things. And that talked about making sure that we were a nation of equals, which at the minute we're absolutely not, which is really quite bleak and probably only helps calls for Scottish and Welsh national independence and nationalism. I think probably looking to me, like one of the things that was great about our 2019 general election manifesto is in there it said that it would give powers to enable, for instance, the formation of a Cornish Assembly or a Yorkshire Parliament. And for me, like that is what I'm really keen on, and that devolution down to me, a Yorkshire Parliament would be absolutely the answer to some of these problems and some of these questions about how we make decision making closer to people, but also make sure it's not devolved down to a level where it sort of loses value or doesn't make sense.
It goes to one person and their office. Yeah, I agree with you. Just before we move on to the last question, I'm going to read Kim's Ledbeater's statement that she submitted, and then we'll go on to the final question for you. To me, it's clear that the biggest long-term challenge to our area is the climate and environmental emergency. The actions we take will be defining for generations to come. And while the climate change can often sound like an abstract threat, it isn't. We have seen people's lives ruined by flooding right here in Batley and Spen, as well as in nearby areas along the river. Oh God, I messed this up. Calder. I'm dyslexic, so this is going to be an interesting thing anyway. Many of these are characterized as in 1 in 100-year events, but are occurring twice in only 12. You can imagine the headaches, or the headache. You can't imagine the headache of being flooded out your home or business until you've experienced it. And climate change is not some future crisis. It is here now. And it will get worse if we do not act. It will be those who can least afford it who will be hit the hardest. That's why tackling the climate threat is also central to building a fairer society. But this isn't just a national or international issue. There is much more we can do locally. We need to work together to bring police and council to reduce traffic congestion and air quality. To do that, we need to improve public transport links. It's great that the West Yorkshire Labour Mayor has made this her priority. And we need to make sure we safeguard our green spaces. People love our area and local countryside. It is a big part of that. It is a big part of us. We must protect it. I've spoken out about the planned Amazon development. If elected, I have already made it clear that one of my priorities will bring good jobs for local people. But they need to be well paid and good quality jobs. And we shouldn't be in the position of trading jobs against our much loved green spaces. As your MP, I will stand with local residents on major planning and development issues. I will take an active role on planning and be an active voice for local people with developers. I will fight to improve our local playgrounds and parks and create more sports pitches and expand and enhance the Spen Valley Greenway and Ringway. Labour is the only party with a bold plan to tackle climate change. We are calling on the government to deliver a Green New Deal for this country, starting with a $3 billion green stimulus to create jobs as we recover from COVID. We need to invest in a recovery that tackles the unemployment crisis and climate crisis. That this package will accelerate investments in clean projects such as energy efficiency, flood prevention, offshore wind, cycling and walking infrastructure, and the electric vehicle charging network would help to create secure, stable employment in every corner of the country right now. The government's climate plans do not rise to the challenge. Our goal should be to go further and faster, cutting the significant majority of emissions in this decisive decade, which is the right way to lead in creating green jobs in the future. We are being held back by underinvestment, delay, inconsistency, and lack of ambition. This is the decisive decade when it comes to the climate crisis, and we cannot afford the Tory complicity, inaction, and lack of direction. The climate crisis is here now. It must be tackled. Would you like anything to say on that, Tom?
I think what is slightly frustrating is that with the Labour Party and what we've seen on this time and time again is that we hear, certainly from the Tory government, sort of gestures and nods towards what they want to do on climate and the environment and the ongoing climate crisis. And the same can be said to be true of the Labour Party. Like, a great example of this is the fact that I can remember at my very first council meeting, when we had on that order paper the climate emergency declaration, I stood up and gave a list of about 3 things that could have been done immediately on that day to start tackling issues related to the climate emergency then and there. That included things like, the fact that we have, there was a mayor's car that drives around. There's no need for a mayoral car in the first instance anyway. And if there was going to be one, then certainly transitioning to a more sustainable fleet, which, sort of looking like electric or hybrids would be the first thing. In terms of the fact that we were still using things in libraries like plastic bottles and don't have water fountains. It's just basic, simple little things that all tie into the environment and the climate crisis that could be done if there was the willpower there. One of the things that is sort of been constantly sort of looked at as well is the fact that trees are being chopped down and cleared as well. And we quite often see, we've planted them elsewhere. Well, one of the things that we do need is we need to make sure our cities are green, not just our countryside. And quite often we see that trees are sort of planted in country parks or out of the way, and actually having a sort of rewilding the urban area is really key to making sure we keep sort of the cities green, clean, and also that's not just on air quality as well, but keep the streets cooler. We know having trees provide shade and also lower the air temperature. There's loads of things that we could do, but the political will certainly isn't there. And when you look across West Yorkshire, across Yorkshire in general, we've got examples of local authorities that are Labour run that are not leading on climate, and they should be and they could be. You look at, for instance, other issues in relation to sort of this. You look at places that are Liberal Democrat local authorities. 4 out of the top 5 for recycling are Liberal Democrat run, because it's something that we know is important and crucial, and it's often something that can cause people a bit of a pain and a hassle to recycle, but it's the right thing to do. And quite often we see councillors or MPs or any other sort of politicians running around chasing votes rather than doing what is the right thing. And that to me is something that is just sort of a little dispiriting. You know, I mean, it's sort of fairly telling I'm the only one who's here tonight, to be quite honest. If you can't have an MP who's got time to talk to you about the climate emergency and the climate change crisis now, why do you think that they would have time to raise it in Parliament or to meet with you in person at any other point down the line? So yeah, I mean, in respect to that, like, it's sort of, if you want an MP who's going to turn up, then I suggest there's one here.
So final question, I promise, and then we'll let you go. You've spoke passionately about local government. So do you support the local electricity bill, giving local councils more access to renewable energy and huge boost to local economies?
So I think this is quite an interesting one. So in principle, yes. I know there are other instances of local authorities. I think it was in Bristol where they set up a similar sort of scheme, and it ended up costing a fortune and went a little bit awry. I mean, in principle, enabling people to make decisions and also sort of generate their own electric and give them more power to do that is only a good thing. Certainly one of the things that I've been dealing with and we've sort of been doing as a local authority is looking at building sort of energy parks, solar parks within the local authority, to try and at least make sure the council's own emissions are cancelled out and cut before we start trying to tackle elsewhere too. Obviously, we need to do both at the same time in parallel and tandem, not one after the other, because if not, it'll be too little too late. But in principle, yes, I think it's just a case of making sure that the people we're handing that power to use it wisely and invest and make good choices in how they're going to do that, and are sort of held to account for those decisions. It's quite difficult to answer, I mean, because you might have one local authority that will make a really great sterling gold star example of how to use those issues and those powers, and then another that might just make an absolute mess of it. So, I mean, it's I hate to
about having the right, having the right thinkers in the right areas.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's all the questions we've really got time for. I'd like to thank Tom for coming today and giving us basically an hour of his busy time during the last run up to this crucial by-election. It's been a pleasure having you all. Do you have any final words, Tom, to say?
I don't really. I think probably at this point I've run through everything that I would normally say anyway. I think for me, actually, like in the grand scheme of things, I know certainly for this hustings, I am not the youngest. But every other hustings, I have been largely the youngest or one of the younger candidates. And actually having a young person involved in these issues, I have a little sister who's 9 as well. I feel very, I mean, for me, like, it's about making sure that I don't want to leave a planet behind to my little sister or other family members. And as well, like at 27, like I'm going to be dealing with this as well. It's not like I'm going to, I'm not going to be just here for 5-10 years more. I mean, I've got my whole life ahead of me, and I don't want to live on a planet where, we've got all these, like, we're destroying the planet, we're chopping down trees, we're pumping out fossil fuels still. And fundamentally, like, it is like what you said earlier about young people who are anxious about the climate emergency. Like, that is something that absolutely resonates with me too. Like, if we don't get a grip of this now, and like there are people already saying it's too late to get a grip, and like whatever we do now is going to be mitigation rather than stopping. And that in itself is really damning and an indictment on the fact that politicians from across the political spectrum have failed young people and have failed to get a grip on the biggest issue of the day. And it can feel quite silly at times talking about, like, EV charging points or walking and cycling routes, like, because fundamentally, like, doing just a little bit of this is not going to make a difference. Like, we know little steps all add up, and that's great, but we need faster, quicker, more now. And it really is infuriating, the amount of meetings I've sat in where we are just moving too slow, too late. And unless this changes now, then certainly the younger generation is the one that's gonna end up paying the price for it. But yeah, as I can see in the comment there, system change is more of an individual change. Like, I'm actively at this point a meat reducer. I'd love to be someone who could completely go vegetarian, but I'd struggle far too much. But like, for me, I am consciously someone who has started cutting down on what I eat in terms of meat, and sort of red meat in particular. Like, things like that, people often sneer at it. Like, if we all did a little bit, it would help. But at the same time, like, fundamentally, we do need to go faster, quicker now. I think that, in a nutshell, you know, in this election, there is no Green candidate. The Green candidate on this ballot paper is the Liberal Democrat. It is me. So if people want an MP who's going to put planet first, then yeah, that'd be great to obviously count on that support.
It's been great speaking to you, Tom, and thank you for being the only candidate in Batley and Spen to actually turn up and speak to us. And everyone who came to actually listen to Tom and to me babble on, I'd like to say thank you for giving us an hour of your evening, and I hope that you all have a good rest of the day.